The fall of Jerusalem, Titus' army versus Hebrews' defenses. Waiting for the Romans in Jerusalem were 23,400 troops, 15,000 under Simon, 6,000 under John, and 2,400 under Eleazar. The Hebrews possessed fortitude of soul that could surmount faction, famine, war, and such a host of calamities, wrote Josephus. Jerusalem was divided into three parts: the 100-acre upper and lower cities in the south, the 150-acre new city in the north, and the 50-acre Temple Mount in the east. The Temple Mount, which crowned Jerusalem, was positioned like a lock connecting the northern and southern sections of the city. Attached to the northwest corner of the Temple Mount was the formidable Antonia Fortress. Within the city were two inner walls. The first wall divided the northern and southern sections of the city, while the second wall afforded an additional layer of defense in the new city. The vanguard of Titus's army cut off communications between Jerusalem and the surrounding countryside upon its arrival in April. Titus cleverly added to the confusion within Jerusalem by allowing pilgrims to enter to celebrate Passover. He had no intention of allowing them to depart, though. He knew that the presence of large numbers of non-combatants would strain the city's food resources. As expected, famine quickly set in. Titus ordered legions 5, 12, and 15 to bivouac on Mount Scopus to the northeast and Legion X to encamp on the Mount of Olives to the east. The Hebrews conducted repeated sorties against the camps that forced Titus to tighten his siege. As the siege progressed, the camps would move closer to the front lines, eventually occupying part of the western portion of the new city. Titus reconnoitered the city and decided to begin his assault on the level ground outside the new town. The Romans punched through the outer wall and the inner wall in just 24 days of fighting. They used bronze-headed battering rams to crack the walls. Roman catapults hurled stones into the center of the city to destroy defenses and inflict casualties. But Titus's initial success, and the casualties he inflicted on the defenders, did not stop the Hebrews from fighting among themselves. John launched a surprise attack against Eleazar's troops holding the temple, in which his troops slaughtered Eleazar's men. When the fighting resumed between the Romans and the Hebrews, John's troops were in possession of the Temple Mount and the Antonia Fortress, while Simon's were deployed along the first wall in defense of the upper and lower city as well as Herod's palace.
Titus subsequently separated his forces in order to attack each of these groups, but the focus of the siege and of the fighting soon moved to the Temple Mount. The Romans began to build ramps against the Antonia Fortress, and their construction went on day and night, with the Roman forces being attacked by hundreds of bolt shooters and stone throwers the Hebrews had captured from the Roman army. While some Hebrews harried the Romans from above, others were tunneling beneath their position and filling the space with bitumen and pitch. Suddenly, the ground beneath the Romans collapsed, and the siege ramps and towers fell into the burning pits. It was a major setback for the Romans. The heavy casualties the Romans had suffered in the house-to-house fighting and in the destruction of their ramps and towers compelled Titus to rethink his strategy. Titus had lost a large number of men in the fighting to that point, and he feared even greater losses trying to take the inner bastions of the city. The Roman commander decided it would be advantageous to tighten his blockade on the city. Titus, therefore, ordered his troops to construct an encircling line around the city to ensure that the Hebrews could not smuggle in supplies. The circumvallation line was 41 house miles long and was strengthened at intervals with 13 forts. In addition, he issued orders that anyone found outside of the city was to be crucified. Pitiful was the fare and lamentable the spectacle, the stronger taking more than their share, the weak whimpering, wrote Josephus. Wives would snatch the food from their husbands, children from fathers, and, most pitiable of all, mothers from the very mouths of their infants. Deserters who were allowed out of the city told of corpses everywhere, stacked up and left unburied. So crazed with hunger were the defenders that they resorted to eating leather belts and harnesses. Josephus himself appealed to the combatants to give up, at least for the sake of the starving, but he was ignored. Titus made a personal appeal to his soldiers to put out the fire to save the great temple, but his soldiers' lust for revenge for the heavy losses they suffered proved too strong in the long run. Yet somehow the defenders found the strength to fight on. They repaired breaches in the walls made by the battering rams and repulsed fresh assaults by the Romans. The Romans explored every possible avenue of attack. In late July, the Romans conducted a night sortie that overwhelmed Hebrew sentries who had fallen asleep at their posts guarding the Antonia Fortress. Next, Titus focused his efforts on capturing the Temple Mount, where the Hebrew forces had concentrated in expectation of a final battle. Although the northern end of the Temple Mount's colonnade had been almost completely destroyed by that point, its western end was still intact. On July 27, the Romans were at work on a series of platforms that would link it with the remains of the northern end. Suddenly, the Hebrew rebels atop the western end dispersed, leaving it undefended.
Some of the Romans probably guessed it was a trap, but the chance to gain control of the elevated colonnade roof was simply too good to pass up. They should have trusted their instincts, for the Hebrews had packed the cedar rafters beneath the colonnade with bitumen, pitch, and dried wood. When the Romans climbed their ladders and reached the roof, the rafters below them burst into flames. The 50-foot-high colonnade collapsed, sending hundreds of Romans down into the city. Those who had advanced beyond the collapsed area had nowhere to go when the flames consumed their ladders. Encircled by the blaze, some flung themselves down into the city behind them, some into the thick of the foe. Many, in the hope of escaping with their lives, jumped down among their own men and broke their legs. Most, for all their haste, were too slow for the fire. A few cheated the flames with their own daggers, wrote Josephus. The remaining individuals, many of whom were severely wounded, eventually succumbed to their wounds. For all of their elation, the Hebrews merely had delayed the inevitable. Sensing that victory was near, Titus pressed the siege of the Temple Mount. Each day he sent legionnaires forward to ram and batter the walls. But the walls were too well made and the individual blocks too thick, so that even prying a handful of them free did nothing to the wall's overall integrity. Frustrated, Titus ordered that the Temple Mount be stormed, but this only led to more lives lost and more standards captured by the enemy. The Hebrew destruction of the western colonnade, while briefly affording the defenders an advantage, had nevertheless made their position vulnerable. When the Romans decided to destroy the northern colonnade, the Hebrew forces secured themselves within the walls of the temple complex. The Temple Mount and inner courtyard were surrounded by thick walls and a handful of strong towers. The temple alone soared 150 feet into the air. The entire complex, known as the Platform Mount, was itself built atop a dais. The series of walls, boundaries, balustrades, gates, and impediments were meant to halt one's progress toward the earthly home of the Hebrew God behind golden gates. It was within sight of these gates that the remnants of the starving Hebrew forces made their last stand. The Hebrews sallied forth on August 9th and attacked the Romans holding the outer court. After 3 hours of seesaw fighting, in which the Hebrews bore the brunt of a Roman cavalry charge, the Hebrews retreated to the inner court once again. The following day the Hebrews attacked the Romans in the outer court again, but found themselves trapped against the northern wall of the Platform Mount. Someone hurled a flaming torch over the wall and into the sanctuary surrounding the temple. No one knows who did it or why. If the cessation of the sacrifice had demoralized the Hebrews, the entire reason for that sacrifice, and for the revolt, was being destroyed. The Hebrews' defensive line and their very religion, the source of their strength both physical and spiritual, were collapsing at the same moment. Chaos, disorder, and looting ensued. The Romans gave no quarter. There was no pity for age, no regard for rank. Little children and old men, laymen and priests alike were butchered, wrote Josephus. He added, the cries from the hill were answered from the crowded streets, and now many who were wasted with hunger and beyond speech found strength to moan and wail when they saw the sanctuary in flames. Jerusalem shall rise again, just behold. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, comment, and share.